There is a kind of person that every major office building in America depends on completely, and never thinks about it all. They arrive in the dark, before the city is fully awake. They move through rooms that will belong to other people in a matter of hours, cleaning up after days that were never theirs, straightening a world they were never invited to participate in. They overhear conversations that were never meant for them. They see things left behind that were never meant to be seen. And because the people in those buildings have decided, without ever quite putting it into words, that these workers are not really present in any way that matters. They say things, and do things, and leave things around in front of them that they would never say or do or leave in front of someone they considered an equal. This is a story about what happens when one of those invisible workers turns out to be the most perceptive person in the building, and about what he did with everything he had seen. His name was James Harrison. He was 62 years old, originally from a small town in rural Georgia, and for 28 years he had worked as a janitor inside the corporate headquarters of Dalton Mercer Industries, one of the largest privately held construction and real estate conglomerates in the southeastern United States. The company had its fingers in everything: commercial real estate development, government infrastructure contracts, land acquisition, private equity partnerships with regional banks and investment firms. It was worth, by most conservative estimates, somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion, depending on the quarter and who was doing the counting. James Harrison cleaned its bathrooms, emptied its trash, and mopped its floors for almost 3 decades. But here is what the people in that building never understood. James was not just cleaning. He was watching. He was recording. And what he had seen over those 28 years would eventually bring the entire company to the edge of collapse, and place him at the center of one of the most extraordinary legal and human stories in recent American corporate history. But to understand how that happened, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who James Harrison was before any of this, and why the world had spent 60 years making the worst possible mistake about him. To understand James Harrison, you have to understand where he came from. He was born in 1957 in Bainbridge, Georgia, a small city in the southwestern corner of the state, close to the Florida border, the kind of place that exists in every American region, but never quite makes it into the stories people tell about ambition and opportunity. His father, Earl Harrison, worked at a paper mill outside of town for 31 years. His mother, Dolores, cleaned houses for wealthier families in the area. They were not poor in the way that generates sympathy or headlines. They were poor in the way that is most common and most invisible. The way where every month is a careful negotiation between what you need and what you can afford, where there is never quite enough, but also never a complete emergency, where you learn to be grateful for stability because you understand instinctively how close to the edge you actually are. James grew up watching both of his parents work that life with dignity. He watched them smile at people who looked through them. He watched his mother enter houses through back doors and leave without anyone asking her name. He learned very early, without anyone telling him directly, that the world had sorted people into categories, into those who were looked at and those who were looked past, and that his family had been assigned to the second group before any of them had done a single thing to deserve it. Here is the moment that determines everything that comes after. Most people who grow up invisible in that way make one of two choices. They spend their life trying to be seen, pushing for recognition, performing for rooms that were never designed to include them, or they disappear into the background entirely, accepting the category the world assigned them before they could speak. James Harrison made neither of those choices. He made a third choice, a quieter choice, one that nobody around him at the time would have recognized as a strategy, because it did not look like one. He decided to pay attention, very close, very careful, very patient attention, to everything, to everyone, to the gap between what people said and what they actually did. He decided, without quite putting it into words, that the world reveals itself most clearly to the people it has decided to ignore, and he was going to use every single thing it showed him. In 1996, through a contact at his church, James was offered a position on the night cleaning crew at the headquarters of Dalton Mercer Industries in Atlanta. He was 39 years old. He took the job because it paid reliably and had benefits. Simple reasons, practical reasons, the kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with destiny. He told Carolyn it was temporary while they figured out the next thing. He told himself the same. He was still working there 28 years later. But what happened in those 28 years was anything but temporary. Because sometime around year 3, James Harrison opened the first notebook. Dalton Mercer Industries in the late 1990s was a company in transition. Walter Mercer, its founder, had built it from nothing starting in 1971. A single commercial development in a suburb of Atlanta that he had financed with a bank loan, a second mortgage on his house, and a level of nerve that people who knew him then still talk about. He was the kind of man who became legendary in his own city before the rest of the world noticed, not because he sought fame, but because he had a quality that drew people to him. He was direct. He kept his word. He had a memory for names and faces and the specific details of every conversation he had ever had, which meant that people who worked with him once wanted to work with him again. By the time James came to work in the building, Walter had built a company that employed over 1,200 people and operated across 4 states. The headquarters was a 12-story building in the Buckhead area of Atlanta, a clean, well-run building that projected exactly the image Walter had always wanted for his company. Solid, professional, built to last. But buildings have floors, and floors get mopped, and the people who mop them hear things. What James Harrison heard in those first years was not yet alarming. It was the ordinary machinery of a successful company. The deal talk, the competitive pressure, the internal politics that exist in every organization above a certain size. He heard arguments about strategy. He heard gossip about who was in favor and who was not. He heard the way people talked about Walter when Walter was not in the room. Sometimes admiringly, sometimes resentfully, always with a particular kind of deference that told James these people understood who held the real power. What interested James, more than any of it, was the gap between what was said in meetings and what was said afterward. The version for the record and the version for the hallway. He had grown up learning to read those gaps. In this building, the gaps were considerable. James Harrison started writing things down in 1999, 3 years into his time at Dalton Mercer. He had not planned to. It began almost by accident. He was cleaning the executive bathroom on the 3rd floor late one evening when he heard 2 men talking just outside the door. He recognized one of the voices as Richard Mercer, Walter's son, then in his late 20s, already being groomed for eventual leadership. The other voice he did not know yet. They were talking about a land parcel, a piece of government-owned property on the outskirts of Atlanta that was being tendered for private development. They were speaking about it the way you speak about a thing that is already decided. The contract, the other man said, is going to Dalton Mercer. Richard said he knew. They spoke a name James recognized from news coverage as a member of the Atlanta City Planning Commission. Then they laughed about something James could not quite make out, and their footsteps moved away down the hall. James finished cleaning the bathroom. He walked to his cart. He went to the break room, where he kept his personal bag. He took out a small spiral notebook he used to write grocery lists, and he wrote down the date, the time, what he had heard, and the name he had recognized. He was not sure why he did it. He said later it just felt like the kind of thing that should be written down. He had no idea he had just started a record that would one day bring federal prosecutors into the same building. Over the next year, he wrote things down 4 more times. Over the next 5 years, the notebook filled, and he started a second one. By 2010, he had 11 notebooks, each one dated and indexed in his careful, precise handwriting, stored in a locked metal box under the floorboards of his apartment. He was not collecting gossip. He was not building a case. Not yet, not consciously. He was simply doing what he had always done, paying attention to the gap between what people said out loud and what was actually true. And what the notebooks were slowly, page by page, beginning to reveal was something that James had suspected for years without quite naming it. The company that presented itself to the world as solid and professional and built to last was, in certain specific and systematic ways, corrupt. And the corruption was not incidental. It was structural. It went to the top. And nobody in that building had the slightest idea that the man pushing the cleaning cart had been documenting it for over a decade. Walter Mercer lost his wife, Margaret, in 2003. She had been his partner in every meaningful sense. Not in the business, which she had always kept a careful distance from, but in his life, in the way that matters more than any business. She had been the person who reminded him what things were actually worth. After she died, Walter began spending more time at the office in the evenings. He was 71 years old, and the company was the thing he had. He would stay late going through files, reading correspondence, walking the building the way people walk places when they are not quite ready to go home. James Harrison was always there in those hours. He had the late shift. And slowly, over months of small exchanges, a nod in the hallway, a brief acknowledgement, the kind of minimal interaction that develops between two people who share a space at an unusual hour. Something began to form between them. Not a friendship exactly, not at first. Something more cautious than that. A mutual recognition between two men who had both, for very different reasons, learned to be careful about who they trusted. It started with a cup of coffee. James was pushing his cart past Walter's office one night around 10 o'clock, and Walter, sitting alone at his desk, held up his coffee mug and asked James if he wanted a cup. James said he was fine, thank you. Walter nodded and went back to his papers. The next night, Walter left a cup of coffee on the corner of his desk with a sticky note that said simply, "For the janitor." James drank it. He washed the mug and left it upside down on the corner of the desk before he left. The next night, there was coffee again. This went on for 3 weeks before they had their first real conversation. About nothing important, about the weather, about the Atlanta Braves who were having a frustrating season. But both of them, James said later, understood that those small exchanges were about something more than coffee or baseball. They were two men in an empty building late at night who had both, for different reasons, learned to be careful about who they trusted. By 2007, Walter and James were having conversations that lasted an hour or more. Walter talked about the company's early years, about deals he had made on instinct, about people who had helped him and people who had betrayed him, about the particular loneliness of being the person at the top who can never fully trust the information that reaches him because everyone around him has a stake in what he believes. James mostly listened. He asked occasional questions. Quiet, precise questions that Walter later wrote in his personal letter were always exactly the right question. He said James had a way of identifying the thing that was actually being discussed underneath the thing that was being said that he had never encountered in anyone in 30 years of running a company full of very intelligent people. And then one night, Walter said something that told James the conversation had shifted into different territory entirely. He said, "I think someone is stealing from me, and I do not know who I can trust to tell me the truth about it." The money started bothering Walter around 2012. He was not a detail man by nature. He had built his career on vision and relationship and instinct, and had always delegated the financial management to people he trusted. Gerald Patton had been his CFO since 1996. Richard had been running day-to-day operations since 2005. Walter had stepped back from direct management gradually and with genuine comfort, because he believed he had built a team he could rely on. But in 2012, during a period when Walter was spending more time reviewing the company's books for a potential refinancing, he started noticing things that did not add up. Vendor payments to companies he did not recognize. Consultant fees that seemed disproportionate to any work he could identify. Contract values that appeared different in the company's internal records than in the filed versions Walter found in his own archives from years earlier. He asked Gerald Patton about some of these discrepancies. Gerald had explanations for all of them. The explanations were detailed and confident and entirely plausible. Walter accepted them, but he wrote them down, and he started paying more attention. Over the next 3 years, Walter built a quiet, private picture of what was happening in his own company. He did not go to lawyers. He did not bring in auditors. He did not confront Richard or Gerald. He did what James Harrison had been doing for 15 years. He watched, and he wrote things down, and he waited until the picture was complete enough to act on. By 2015, the picture was ugly. The pattern he had identified suggested that money was being diverted from the company through a network of fraudulent vendor contracts. Real companies that did small amounts of legitimate work but were also being paid for work that was never done, with the excess flowing through to accounts that Walter could not trace. The total amount, based on his own rough calculations, was in the tens of millions of dollars. And the signatures authorizing the payments were consistently those of Gerald Patton and Richard Mercer, his own son, his most trusted financial officer. In the spring of 2017, Walter Mercer kept James Harrison late in the building. It was close to 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. He called James into his office and closed the door. He sat behind his desk and James sat in a chair across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Walter looked at James and said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. James said he would. Walter said, in all the years you have worked in this building, have you ever seen anything that made you think something was wrong? James was quiet for a long time. Walter waited. And then James said yes. Walter said nothing. He waited. And James said, I think you should know that I have been keeping records since 1999. Walter did not speak for almost 2 minutes after James said that. It took 2 separate conversations over the following week for James to tell Walter about the notebooks. He did not tell him everything at once. He was careful, deliberate, assessing the situation the same way he had always assessed everything. But what he shared in that first conversation was enough to confirm for Walter that what he had suspected was not paranoia or the confusion of an old man, but the reality of his own company. James told Walter about the land deal he had overheard in 1999, the one that had started the first notebook. He told Walter about a conversation he had recorded in 2004 involving Gerald Patton and a man he had later identified as a Nashville city official, held in the building's parking garage at 6 in the morning. He told Walter about documents he had seen in the shredder room that had caught his attention enough to photograph before they were destroyed. Walter listened without interrupting. When James finished, Walter was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, How long have you had all of this? James said, Since the beginning. Walter stood and walked to his window. He stood there looking out at Atlanta for a long time. He said, I should have talked to you years ago. James said nothing. He had already thought that too many times. James went home that night and took the boxes out from under the floor. He sat at his kitchen table with all 11 notebooks in front of him and spent 3 hours going through them, cross-referencing what he had with what Walter had shared with him. The 2 sets of records were not identical. They came from different vantage points, different levels of the organization, different kinds of access. But they told the same story. And together, James realized, they told it completely. What Walter did not yet know, what James did not tell him that night, was that the notebooks were only part of what was in that box. There were also photographs, dozens of them, 20 years of disposable camera images of documents that were never supposed to be seen by anyone outside the executive floor. Camera images of documents that were never supposed to be seen by anyone outside the executive floor. He called his daughter Denise the next morning, not to tell her what was happening, just to hear her voice. He did not tell anyone what he had. He did not tell anyone what was coming. He put the notebooks back in the box and put the box back under the floor and went to work. Walter Mercer had 3 biological children. Richard, the eldest, who ran the company. A daughter named Sandra who lived in Charleston and had largely removed herself from the family business by choice. A younger son named Thomas who had struggled with addiction for most of his adult life and whom Walter had spent decades trying to help with limited success. Walter had grandchildren. He had a legal team. He had a financial advisor who had managed his personal fortune for 20 years. He had, by any traditional measure, a full complement of people to whom a man in his position might logically leave his estate. Instead, in late 2017, Walter Mercer contacted an attorney named Patricia Osei, a specialist in corporate fraud and estate law whom he had found through a referral from a retired federal judge he trusted, and told her he wanted to restructure his will completely. He told her he wanted to do it quietly, outside the usual channels, using none of the lawyers who had previously worked with Dalton Mercer Industries or the Mercer family. He told her the most important beneficiary was a man named James Harrison who worked as a janitor in his building. Patricia Osei later described that conversation as one of the most surprising of her career. She also said that by the time Walter Mercer had finished explaining his reasoning, it was one of the most logical. Walter met with Patricia 4 times over 8 months. He brought documentation to each meeting. He brought the financial records he had assembled. He brought notes from his own private investigation. He brought 2 personal diaries he had kept over the preceding 5 years. And he brought a detailed written account of his relationship with James Harrison. Not a sentimental document, but a precise one. A record of what James had shared with him, what James had observed, what James had preserved, and why Walter believed James was the person best positioned to do with the company what Walter now believed needed to be done. Patricia reviewed all of it. She also arranged, at her own insistence, before drafting a single word of the will, for Walter to undergo a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by a physician with no connection to anyone involved. Then she arranged for a second one. Both evaluations confirmed full cognitive competence. Both were notarized and filed securely. Patricia had been doing this work long enough to know that a will like this one was going to be challenged. She was going to make sure it could not be broken. She was right too, because what was coming would be one of the most aggressive estate battles any probate court in Georgia had ever seen. The will gave James Harrison 51% of the voting shares of Dalton Mercer Industries. The remaining 49% went to three charitable foundations Walter had established over the years. Organizations focused on affordable housing development, vocational training for low-income workers, and rural healthcare access in southern Georgia. 0 shares went to any member of the Mercer family. 0. The will also directed that a sealed package held by Patricia Osei be delivered to James upon Walter's death, a package containing the financial records Walter had assembled, copies of internal communications, the names of people Walter believed were involved, and a personal letter from Walter to James. Separately, Walter amended his personal estate, his house, his personal bank accounts, his investment portfolio, which totaled approximately $40 million, to be divided equally among his 3 children. He was not disinheriting his family entirely. He was making a clear and specific decision about who should hold the power over the company he had built, and he was making it with full knowledge of what that decision would mean. He told Patricia he felt lighter than he had in years. Walter Mercer died on March 14, 2019. He had been in declining health for 2 years. He passed away in the early hours of the morning at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, with Richard at his bedside and several senior executives waiting in the corridor outside. The hospital had barely sent the death notice when the legal machinery began to move. Richard's personal attorney received a call before 6 in the morning. The company's general counsel was briefed by 8. By 9 o'clock, 3 of the senior executives had connected with their own lawyers. By noon, there were conversations about succession planning, about what the will would say, about how to handle the transition. Nobody was thinking about James Harrison. James Harrison was at home eating breakfast when Patricia Osei called to tell him that Walter had died. She told him he needed to come to her office. James took the bus across the city. He arrived at her office at 10:30 in the morning, carrying a paper bag with a sandwich he had made at home. He sat down across from her. She placed the will on the table between them. He read it twice, very slowly. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at her and said, "He actually did it." The will was filed with the Fulton County Probate Court on March 18, 2019. By March 20th, 2 days later, Richard Mercer had retained 3 separate law firms. The following day, the company issued a public statement describing the will as the product of undue influence exerted on an elderly man in cognitive decline. The family's legal team submitted, within the same week, an affidavit from a physician who had seen Walter twice in the year before his death, stating that Walter had displayed signs of confusion and impaired judgment. They also filed an emergency motion to freeze all corporate assets pending a full review of the estate. They moved to have James Harrison's appointment as controlling shareholder suspended until the probate challenge was resolved. They contacted 2 of the company's major banking partners and suggested that the estate situation created uncertainty about the company's leadership that might be relevant to their existing credit relationships. They were, in short, trying to strangle the situation from every direction simultaneously, legally, financially, and publicly, before James Harrison could get his footing. What they did not know was that James Harrison had known this was coming for 2 years. Walter had told him exactly what they would do. James Harrison, at the moment all of this was happening, was a 62-year-old white man from rural Georgia who had worked a cleaning job for nearly 3 decades, who lived in a modest apartment in southwest Atlanta, who drove a 15-year-old car with a cracked dashboard, and who had a savings account with less than $6,000 in it. He had never retained a lawyer for anything more significant than a lease dispute. He had no financial advisor. He had no business contacts of the kind that would be useful in a corporate governance fight. He had 2 adult children, an elderly sister, a church he attended most Sundays, and a box of notebooks under his floor. What Richard Mercer's team of lawyers, executives, and public relations professionals did not know, what none of them had thought to consider, was that the man they were about to face across the table had spent 28 years studying exactly how they operated. He had listened through every wall in that building. He had watched every power move, every intimidation tactic, every strategy for making a problem disappear. He knew their playbook in detail. And unlike them, He was not performing with confidence. He actually had it. Patricia Osei filed her initial response to the challenge on April 3, 2019. It was, by every account from attorneys who later reviewed it, a document of exceptional quality. It included the 2 psychiatric evaluations of Walter Mercer, both dated and notarized before Walter's death. It included video recordings of Patricia's meetings with Walter, recordings Walter had explicitly consented to and which showed, clearly and without any possible ambiguity, a man who was lucid, specific, purposeful, and fully aware of what he was doing and why. It included a statement from Walter's primary physician that directly contradicted the family's hired expert, and it included a detailed timeline of the will's drafting that made the undue influence argument essentially impossible to sustain on the facts. The opposing lead attorney asked for a 60-day extension before responding. It was his first significant miscalculation. He would make more. The press got hold of the story within 2 weeks of the will being filed. The initial coverage was not kind to James. Several outlets framed it as the unlikely heir, a working-class man and over his head, a sweet story of a loyal janitor and a lonely old billionaire. One widely shared article described him as a simple man who had formed a bond with a confused elderly man in his final years. James read these articles. He did not respond to any of them. He went to Patricia's office. He went home. He kept working the hotel job. He did not yet fully trust that any of this would resolve in his favor, and having money coming in mattered to him psychologically. But what none of the journalists covering the story understood, what nobody outside of Patricia Waz's office understood, was that James Harrison had not yet opened the sealed package from Walter. He had read the will. He had read the personal letter. But the documents, the financial records, the communications, the list of names, he had not touched yet. He was waiting until he was ready. He opened it on a Saturday morning in May, alone, with coffee, and spent 4 hours going through it. When he finished, he did not move for a long time. Then he called Patricia. He told her, "Walter did not just leave me a company. He left me a case." On June 11, 2019, Patricia Osei filed a motion that stopped the opposing legal team cold. Attached to it was a 32-page summary, drawing on Walter's own records, on James's photographs, and on 20 years of dated and indexed notebooks, documenting a pattern of financial misconduct inside Dalton Mercer Industries going back to the late 1990s. Specific dates, specific names, specific amounts, cross-referenced across 2 independent sources that had never compared notes until 2017. Richard Mercer's lead attorney requested an emergency recess 30 minutes after receiving the filing. He was gone from the conference room for over an hour. When he returned, the conversation had changed, because the opposing team had walked into that room prepared to fight a probate case about a confused old man and a janitor who had gotten lucky. Instead, they were looking at potential criminal exposure that had nothing to do with the will and everything to do with what their clients had been doing for 20 years. The trap had been set long before anyone knew there was a trap. Within 3 weeks of that filing, 3 things happened in rapid succession that told James and Patricia exactly how exposed the other side truly was. Gerald Patton, the CFO of 19 years, resigned citing personal health reasons. Effective immediately, no transition period, no farewell announcement. One of the executives who had filed the original asset freeze motion quietly withdrew from the case entirely and retained a criminal defense attorney, a different type of lawyer than you hire for a probate dispute. And Richard Mercer's legal team, which had been publicly calling the will fraudulent and had given media briefings about the family's confidence in the case, stopped talking to reporters entirely. Within 48 hours of Patricia's filing, 3 of the most powerful people in that building had effectively told on themselves. They just did not realize yet that the man with the notebooks had expected exactly this. In September 2019, 6 months after Walter Mercer's death, Richard Mercer's legal team made a private approach to Patricia Osei. They wanted to settle. The offer was structured in several parts. A cash payment to James Harrison personally, a buyout of his shares at a valuation that was generous by almost any measure, a full release of all claims in both directions, and a non-disclosure agreement that would seal everything that had been filed and prevent James from discussing any aspect of the case publicly or with any government authority. The total value of what was being offered to James, when Patricia walked him through all the components, was in the range of $80 to $90 million. It was, objectively, an extraordinary sum of money for a man who had spent his life working for hourly wages. Patricia told him she had a legal and professional obligation to present it to him and to advise him that it was, from a purely financial standpoint, a serious offer. She also told him it was his decision entirely, and that she would support whichever direction he chose. James Harrison took 3 days to think about it. He talked to his daughter Denise, who told him she would support whatever he decided and meant it. He talked to his son Marcus, who was less certain but ultimately said the same. He went to church on Sunday and sat in the building for a long time after the service ended. He thought about his mother cleaning houses for 40 years without anyone knowing her name. He thought about Walter Mercer sitting alone at his office window, the last years of his life quietly documenting the betrayal of people he had trusted and built everything with. He thought about Gerald Patton and Richard Mercer and all the conversations he had overheard for 28 years. All the certainty those men had carried about who mattered in the world and who did not, about who was a participant in events and who was merely background, about what they could do in a room where nobody important was watching. He called Patricia on Monday morning. He told her the answer was no. He told her that Walter had not spent the last years of his life building a case so that James could trade it for personal comfort. He told her he was going to finish what Walter started. Patricia said she understood. She asked him if he was sure. He said he was certain. James Harrison went further than just rejecting the settlement. He told Patricia he wanted to cooperate fully and completely with every federal investigation, providing every document, giving every interview prosecutors asked for, testifying publicly if it came to that, and doing all of it in a way that could not be undone with a check and a signature. He told her he understood what that meant for his time, his privacy, his safety. He said Walter had trusted him to see it through. He said that 28 years of writing things down in notebooks under a floor had not been an accident. He had always believed that the truth was worth keeping even when no one was asking for it. This was the moment no one was asking for it had finally ended. What nobody outside of James and Patricia knew at this point, and what would not become clear until the federal investigation was well underway, was that the notebooks were only part of what James had kept. During his 28 years in that building, he had also done something that nobody in the building would have thought to stop him from doing, because nobody thought he was worth thinking about. Every time he had photographed a document in a shredder tray or a printer tray or an open trash bin, he had made 2 copies of each photograph, one for the box under his floor and one that he had quietly mailed to a post office box he rented in his sister's name in Bainbridge, Georgia, 200 miles away. He had started doing that in 2006, after overhearing a conversation about the company's IT security policy. He had realized then that if anything ever happened to him or his apartment, the primary copy could be destroyed. The backup copies had been sitting in a post office box in southwest Georgia for 13 years, completely untouched, completely unknown. When the federal investigators learned about them, the lead attorney on the case said she had genuinely never encountered anything like it in 22 years of prosecution work. The federal investigation into Dalton Mercer Industries was formally opened by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia in November 2019. James Harrison met with federal investigators for the first time on November 14th of that year. The meeting lasted 6 hours. He brought all 11 notebooks and a typed index he had created that cross-referenced the notebooks with the documents from Walter's package. The lead investigator on the case later said, in a public statement following the eventual indictment, that the evidentiary foundation James Harrison provided was among the most comprehensive and well-organized they had encountered from a non-law enforcement source. She said his records had a quality of precision and care that allowed investigators to move directly to verification of specific transactions rather than spending months trying to identify where to start looking. She said it shortened the investigation by an estimated 18 months. The picture that emerged from the federal investigation over the following 18 months was detailed and ugly. Beginning around 2007, Richard Mercer and Gerald Patton had established a network of vendor relationships with companies that performed small amounts of legitimate work but were also used as conduits for fraudulent payments. Inflated invoices, fictitious work orders, falsified contract amendments, with excess money routed through a series of accounts before landing in personal accounts controlled by Patton, Richard, and 2 other executives. Additionally, Two of the company's government contracts had been obtained through payments to officials in Nashville and North Georgia. Three of those officials were also investigated. The total amount confirmed as fraudulently obtained or diverted was $68.4 million over 12 years. When the lead investigator presented those numbers to her supervisors for the first time, she placed James Harrison's first notebook, a worn spiral notepad with a grocery list on the first page and a date and a name and a government contract written on the second, on top of the stack. She said that was where it had started, and it was important to remember that. Gerald Patton was the first to break. In January 2021, he signed a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. In his proffer interviews, the sessions where a cooperating witness tells investigators everything they know in exchange for consideration at sentencing, Patton confirmed every element of the scheme that investigators had already identified and added several that they had not. He confirmed that Richard Mercer had initiated the arrangement. He confirmed that at least two people on the company's board of directors had known what was happening and had chosen to ignore it in exchange for annual bonuses that were structured to give them plausible deniability. He confirmed that efforts had been made, at two separate points, to identify who might be documenting activities within the company, and that those efforts had never focused on the night cleaning crew. Patton was asked by investigators why they had never thought to worry about the janitors. He said it had simply never occurred to anyone. James Harrison, when he was told this detail, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Richard Mercer did not go quietly. He fought the indictment from the day it was handed down in March 2021 to the last day of his trial 17 months later. His defense argued he had been following practices established in his father's era, that he had relied on Patton for financial oversight and had no direct knowledge of how payments were processed on the back end, and that James Harrison's notebooks were the product of a man cultivated by a deteriorating old father attempting to punish his son. The jury heard 6 weeks of testimony. They heard from federal accountants, from cooperating witnesses, from city officials who described being approached about payments on government contracts. And then they heard from James Harrison. He walked into the courtroom on a Tuesday morning in August 2022 in a dark suit his daughter had helped him pick out the week before. He sat in the witness box and looked directly at the jury. He answered every question clearly and precisely. He was cross-examined for a full day by Richard's lead attorney, who tried every available technique to suggest his notebooks were selective, his memory unreliable, and his relationship with Walter compromised. James answered every question the same way he had answered questions his whole life. Carefully, without rushing, saying exactly what he knew and nothing beyond it. The jury watched him for 2 days. You can always tell, if you are paying attention, when someone is telling the truth. The Fulton County Probate Court issued its ruling on the estate challenge on January 15, 2021, the same week Gerald Patton signed his cooperation agreement, though the timing was coincidental. The challenge brought by Richard Mercer's legal team was denied in full. The court found that the evidence of Walter Mercer's competence at the time of drafting was overwhelming and unchallenged by credible expert testimony. The court further found that the documentation of Walter's reasoning for his decisions was unusually thorough and demonstrated not confusion or manipulation, but deliberate and well-considered intent. The will stood. James Harrison was confirmed as the rightful heir to Walter Mercer's controlling interest in Dalton Mercer Industries. Patricia Osei called James at home when the ruling came through. He was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he said, "What do we do now?" Patricia said, "Now we run a company." Gerald Patton was sentenced in October 2021 to 4 years in a federal correctional facility and ordered to pay back $11.2 million in restitution. He was 61 years old. He served 3 years and 4 months. 2 other executives received sentences of 18 months and 27 months respectively. The third, who had cooperated earliest, received 12 months of home confinement. The Nashville city official pleaded guilty in state court separately. Then came Richard Mercer. The jury deliberated for 3 days and 2 nights on the 9 counts against him. On the morning of the 4th day, they returned their verdicts. Richard Mercer was found guilty on 7 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government, and money laundering on 5 specific transactions that had been most thoroughly documented. He showed no visible reaction when the verdicts were read. He was sentenced 4 months later to 9 years in federal prison. He was 53 years old. He has not spoken publicly since the day of his sentencing. The man who had called the will fraudulent, who had tried to freeze James out of his own inheritance, who had told reporters his father had lost his mind, was going to federal prison, and the janitor was running the company. The first new position James Harrison created at Dalton Mercer Industries was not a new CFO, not a new CEO, not a head of strategy or a communications director. The first new position he created was called the Director of Workforce Accountability. The role was tasked specifically with ensuring that the workers at the bottom of the organization, the maintenance crews, the cleaning staff, the facilities teams, the contract laborers, were paid fairly, were protected from retaliation, and had a direct line to the board that did not go through middle management. The person in the role was given a direct line to James personally and could not be terminated without board approval. James funded the position initially out of his own share of the estate. When asked by the board why he had created that particular role first, before any other structural change, James said, "Because those are the people who see everything." And until now, nobody was listening to them. James Harrison rebuilt the board of directors from the ground up. 7 seats, 3 going to people with no prior connection to Dalton Mercer Industries, 2 to experienced clean hands developers, 1 to a retired federal judge with corporate governance expertise, and 1, at James's specific insistence, to a woman named Dorothy Reyes, who had spent 20 years advocating for construction industry workers and had never sat on a corporate board in her life. He insisted on a fully independent audit of every company account going back 15 years. He insisted on a clause in every future executive contract giving the board the authority to terminate without cause if any financial impropriety was found. And he directed the board to publish the company's full audited financial statements on its public website every year. Not a summary, the complete audit, something virtually unheard of for a privately held company of its size. 2 board members objected. They said it was unnecessary and competitively disadvantageous. James told them he had spent 28 years watching what happened inside a company where the people at the top believed they could operate without scrutiny. He told them transparency was not a marketing strategy. It was the point. The board voted 5-2 in favor. Under James Harrison's oversight, Dalton Mercer Industries is smaller than it was at its corrupt peak. Several divisions built around the fraudulent contracting relationships were dissolved during reorganization. The company refocused on what Walter Mercer had originally built it to do: legitimate commercial and residential development in the southeastern United States. Its workforce development program now offers paid apprenticeships and career pathways specifically targeted at people from low-income backgrounds entering the construction trades. 3 cohorts have completed the program since 2022. 14 participants have moved into permanent positions with the company. James Harrison has met every single one of them personally. He drives a 4-year-old truck. He lives in a modest house in southwest Atlanta, a neighborhood near where he grew up, where his sister still lives. He still wakes up early. He does not own a yacht or a second home or a private plane. He said once, in an interview, that he did not think of what he had as wealth. He thought of it as responsibility. He said those were 2 very different things, and that the people who confused them were exactly the kind of people who ended up needing someone like him to come along eventually. James Harrison has never released the full text of Walter Mercer's personal letter to him. He has shared portions of it in interviews, always carefully and always with a kind of deliberateness that makes clear he has thought about what to share and what to keep private. What he has said publicly is this: that Walter apologized in the letter, not for the legal situation he was placing James in, not for the weight of what he was asking. Walter apologized for the years, the many years at the beginning of their acquaintance, when he had looked past James the way everyone else in the building did. He apologized for the fact that it had taken him so long to see that the person in his building who understood it most clearly, who had watched it most carefully, who had the clearest and most complete picture of what was actually happening inside it, was the person he passed in the hallway every evening without ever stopping to think about who he was. Walter wrote that he had spent a lot of time, in the last years of his life, thinking about what it meant that James had kept those notebooks for 20 years without anyone asking him to, without any guarantee that they would ever matter, without any particular reason to believe that the world would ever create a situation where what he had documented would be used for anything. He said he thought it was one of the most extraordinary acts of faith he had ever encountered. A faith not in any particular person or outcome, but in the possibility that what was true would eventually matter. That the gap between what people said and what they did could eventually be made visible. That being the person who noticed things and recorded them honestly was worth something, even if you could not see yet what it was worth or when it would be used. Walter wrote that meeting James had changed how he thought about what it meant to pay attention, and that the greatest regret of his life was not the corruption, not the years of not looking closely enough at his own company. It was the decades of looking past the man who was seeing it most clearly. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped James could forgive him. He said he believed James already had, because James was not a man who held on to things that did not serve the truth. James Harrison said in his 2023 interview that he had read that section of Walter's letter many times. He said he did not think Walter needed to forgive himself for it. He said he had understood, for most of his life, how the world sorted people, who it decided was worth seeing and who it decided was background. He said he had made a choice a long time ago not to spend his energy being angry at the people who had made that sorting decision about him, because that anger would have taken everything else. He said he had spent that energy instead on paying attention, on being, every day and in every situation, the kind of person who noticed things and wrote them down and believed that the truth was worth keeping even when nobody was asking for it. He said he had never known, on any of those nights in that building, whether any of it would ever matter. He said he had decided it mattered anyway. He said that was the only decision he had ever made that he was completely certain about. We like to tell a certain kind of story about how the world works. We like to say that talent rises, that hard work is rewarded, that the people who deserve recognition will eventually receive it. It is a comfortable story, but the honest version is considerably messier. The honest version includes all the James Harrisons who paid attention for decades and were never asked about it. It includes all the Dorothys and Earls and Carolyns who cleaned and moved and built and served and were never seen clearly by the people they made comfortable. It includes all the notebooks under all the floors in all the buildings. The records kept by people who had learned not to expect that anyone would ever ask what they had seen. James Harrison's story is not ultimately about Walter Mercer's generosity. It is not about a single unusual will. It is about what a person can build in 28 years of quiet, consistent, honest attention, and about what that kind of attention is actually worth when the moment finally arrives that needs it. The world had decided James Harrison was not important. James Harrison had decided, long before anyone agreed with him, that what he was doing mattered. That is the story. That is the whole story. The rest is just the part that finally became visible. And here is the question this story leaves you with, the one that is harder to sit with than any of the legal details or the dollar figures or the verdicts. How many James Harrisons are there right now? In how many buildings? In how many cities? Watching, recording, waiting. And whose companies, whose institutions, whose systems of power are depending on the fact that nobody is going to look twice at the person pushing the cart. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The people who move through the world quietly, who notice everything and say nothing and keep records of what is true. They deserve to have their stories told. This channel exists to find those stories and tell them with the honesty they deserve. Subscribe so you are here when the next one comes. Because there are more of these stories than you think, and they are almost never the ones getting the most attention.